um, and wherever else we go. But to all who are joining us from the many places, which are turning out to be north of where my colleague Karen and I are in Seattle on Duwamish land, where the Elliott Bay Book Company is located. And we're sort of in between the two people who are with us tonight. We're celebrating Maggie Shipstead and the publication 2 days ago of her extraordinary new novel, Great Circle. And with her in conversation will be Kate Harris, who's probably almost the same distance north of us, in a place just on the, I think it's on the, I'm still not sure if it's British Columbia or Yukon side of the border with Alaska, but she is joining us. And she also, the focus is on Maggie and her new book, but we do want to point out Kate is the author of a wonderful book set mostly in Central Asia called Lands of Lost Borders. And some of Kate's interests as a writer, including a future book she's working on, come to bear as she not only lives in the northern and I won't call it remote because there are people actually in a community up there and saying, what do you mean remote? But remote from some parts, some things, but also in the work she's working on, there's quite a bit about flying. Flying is one of the things, the many things that Maggie Shipstead has done in this new book. And it's a book that, as I say, just came out. So I don't think too many people who are attending have had a chance yet. Although, in fact, if you have had a chance, you might not have even put the book down because it's a book that's very hard to put down. It's extraordinary writing, and it is a book, it's a multifaceted novel in terms of where it's set, who it's set among, and what the characters all do. And there are major characters, but the minor characters are the ones at least who don't appear in a lot of places or pages also play a role, or they're drawn so wonderfully by Maggie in this book. There's a central character, I guess you would say, a woman whose story it provides the biggest arc of the book, but there are some other central figures whose lives also kind of are intertwined with hers. And I'm not going to say too much about this because I think Maggie and Kate will go where I think they'll say more as to what should be said, and then they're going to leave some parts for you as readers to find out. It is a book, since we're in Seattle, to say that a good part of it is set in Seattle. There are a lot of things happen here in the 1940s primarily. The scope of the book is kind of a period, most of it at least, from the early, actually a lot of the 20th century, but a lot of it in the 30s and 40s. There's a real kind of central part, but it's people's lives, who is with who's not with who. There's certainly there's a whole question of lost families, parents who die and children who are raised by others. And so senses of family are drawn out, companions, and who is with who in longer term ways, but also who finds during wartime at all companionship and love and comfort with others. And all these things are done in this sort of beautiful way. It's a book that feels like it's set in its time, and you as a reader have to get to sort of put yourself in some of those constraints. There aren't cell phones, there aren't some of the things we were just talking about, and there were trains, not except for the beginning of passenger flights. Anyway, all this has been done. This is Maggie's third novel, following Astonish Me and Seating Arrangements, two wonderful books. She's also received the Dylan Thomas Prize and other awards and honors. And I have a feeling this book will get queued up for some of those as well. Maggie's with us from Los Angeles, and Kate from up north of us, and all of us. I see people in the Eastern time zones, and probably the more northern audience members than we've had for all the various programs we've done and all the places people have attended. So we thank you all for doing that. My colleague Karen has been, will put more in the chat about the books, both Maggie's and Kate's, but we hope you will also put questions in, because I'm going to disappear here shortly while Maggie reads and Kate and she then have a conversation. But I will come back with, once you put some questions in later on, and I think it'll add nicely to the conversation, which ideally would be happening in the same room, but we also get to take advantage of where everyone is. The room behind Kate is, we haven't had many rooms like that in these programs. That especially, I guess, is sort of significant. And so that's part of it too, is who's where and what. So thank you again for being with us, everyone. And now please get ready to hear about an amazing and wonderful new novel, Great Circle, by the person who wrote it, Maggie Shipstead and Kate Harris. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Oh, it's great to be here. Well, maybe, Maggie, I don't know if you want to start with the reading or start with kind of a synopsis, something to bring people in to.
Yeah, I'll just do my like 3-sentence synopsis. Otherwise it turns into many more sentences. So I kind of have to, and then I'll just read from the very beginning of the book so people can kind of get a feel. But yeah, so Great Circle is about a female pilot named Marion Graves, who's fictional. I've had a lot of people be like, I had to Google her. She does not exist. And she's born in 1914. She learns to fly in Missoula, Montana in the 20s. She flies in Alaska in the 30s. She flies in World War II in the UK, transporting warplanes. And then she disappears in 1950 while trying to fly around the world north-south. And her story is intertwined with a modern day movie star named Hadley Baxter, who's playing her in a biopic, and is sort of scandal plagued and looks to Marion's life for some guidance in her own, and also then becomes sort of sucked into the mystery of what happened to Marion. So this is the very beginning of the book, and I'll just read very briefly, just a couple minutes. Final entry from the sea, the sky, the birds between, the lost logbook of Marion Graves, published by D. Wenceslas and Sons, New York, 1959. Little America 3, Ross Ice Shelf, Antarctica, March 4th, 1950. I was born to be a wanderer. I was shaped to the earth like a seabird to a wave. Some birds fly until they die. I have made a promise to myself. My last descent won't be the tumbling, helpless kind, but a sharp gannet plunge, a dive with intent, aimed at something deep in the sea. I'm about to depart. I will try to pull the circle up from below, bringing the end to meet the beginning. I wish the line were a smooth meridian, a perfect taut hoop, but our course was distorted by necessity, the indifferent distribution of islands and airfields, the plane's need for fuel. I don't regret anything, but I will if I let myself. I can think only about the plane, the wind, and the shore so far away, where land begins again. The weather is improving. We've fixed the leak as best we can. I will go soon. I hate the never-ending day. The sun circles me like a vulture. I want a respite of stars. Circles are wondrous because they are endless. Anything endless is wondrous, but endlessness is torture too. I knew the horizon could never be caught, but still chased it. What I have done is foolish. I had no choice but to do it. It isn't how I thought it would be, now that the circle is almost closed, the beginning and end held apart by one last fearsome piece of water. I thought I would believe I'd seen the world, but there's too much of the world and too little of life. I thought I would believe I'd completed something, but now I doubt anything can be completed. I thought I would not be afraid. I thought I would become more than I am, but instead I know I am less than I thought. No one should ever read this. My life is my one possession. And yet, and yet, and yet.
So good. So much lift in those sentences.
Oh, thank you.
I mean, you describe flight incredibly beautifully and incredibly accurately all through the book. And maybe, starting at the start, I love particularly the description of Marion's first flight, like the miracle of it, the sense of the air's aliveness, the world's aliveness. So is this your imagination at work, or did you take flight lessons yourself? I know your brother is a pilot.
Yeah, I did not take flying lessons. So it's really a relief to hear an actual pilot say that it was okay. This happened to me with my second book too, which is about ballet, and ballet dancers didn't read it until it was out. And I was just kind of like, so I considered taking flying lessons. I have really poor spatial relations. So I just had this feeling like all my instincts would be wrong. The one time I was at the controls of a plane was in a glider, And obviously the pilot was sitting behind me and he was like, okay, you can turn. And I turned and it felt so precarious and weird. And there's a scene where Hadley, takes a flying lesson and she just feels strange. And that's how it felt to me. So I just read as much as I could, books both by and about pilots, and even like more technical books from the era, from the 20s. It helped that those early planes were quite simple mechanically. And then I showed sections that I'd written to my brother, who is now, he's about to leave the Air Force after 20 years. And he was a C-130 pilot for a long time. So I'd sort of, pass the ones I was nervous about off to him and get his okay on it. But yeah, it was the product of a lot of research. And when I could, I would seek out opportunities to fly on, to land on glaciers and things like that. That was really important to me. One really serendipitous thing that happened was I was at the little aviation museum in Missoula when I was maybe 2 years into writing the book. And so I knew Marion would fly there in the 20s. And I was kind of poking around and these two guys came and kind of opened up the big doors and started wheeling out this plane and kind of back over their shoulder. One of them was like, I'll tell that lady if she wants to come along, she can. And I was like, me? Like, I'm the lady? And they were like, yeah, come on. So I went out and we went up in a 1927 Travel Air 6000, which is the plane that I then had Marion learn to fly. So it was like the exact right plane in the exact right place. And it was just this funny thing that happened. It was incredible stroke of luck.
Yeah. Wow. Well, and I read in your acknowledgements as well that it was a trip to New Zealand. You saw Jean Batten, a sculpture or statue or something, and eventually reading about this like early woman pilot sparked the first line of your book. And
yeah,
how did that launch the whole book right there, or had you already been mulling over this?
No, that was it. So this was in like fall of 2012, and so Seating Arrangements was out and astonished me. I was kind of waiting for edits, and I had a different project I'd written maybe 100 pages of, and I thought would be my third novel. But I was traveling New Zealand for a month. I thought I'd work on it. I didn't. It just was kind of lifeless. And so I was at the airport in Auckland and ready to go home and was kind of feeling sorry for myself. And then the terminal, I believe, is named after Jean Batten. There's a statue of her outside waving and a plaque inscribed with a quote from her that starts, "I was destined to be a wanderer." And I just thought, oh, I should write a book about a pilot. Like, that would be interesting. And it was really just as simple as that. And of course, the first line of Great Circle is, I was born to be a wanderer. So I, adapted her line. And it really wasn't, it was 2 years until I started writing after that. And I didn't do a ton of thinking about it, just a bit. But I think that gestation period was still probably sort of helpful subconsciously.
And as you, maybe I'll continue with the women pilot thing just a little bit longer because it's so good. I was so impressed at all the name dropping of names that should be names you drop in aviation, and it should be household names, but people only know Amelia Earhart. They don't know Amy Johnson and Eleanor Smith, and it seems like the fact that people thought Marion Graves was an actual pilot is like the highest compliment. But it's also revealing of the fact that so few people know of this history of the dynamic role women have played in aviation. And when you sort of got onto Jean Batten, did that just send you, a couple years later, you get deeper into the subject?
Yeah, absolutely. Because when I would say during the years I was writing it that I was writing about a female pilot, people would be like, oh, like Amelia Earhart, which is sort of fair enough. Like, I do say she disappears while flying around the world. But exactly what you're describing is so interesting to me. Just at the time, there were a lot of female pilots who are household names. If you broke a speed record or an altitude record in the mid 30s, like, you were on the front page of the newspaper. So all these women were familiar to a lot of people and did these incredibly daring things, like the accounts of like Jean Batten's flight or Amy Johnson flying from England to Australia. And you have to land just wherever, like in the desert and Iraq, what's now Iraq. And, she describes sitting on the tail of her plane in a sandstorm, like fending off wild dogs. It's just unimaginable, and flying across oceans in single engine planes. So I think, Amelia Earhart's legacy is so defined by her disappearance. And I think it's overwhelmingly likely she just crashed in the ocean, ran out of fuel, crashed in the ocean, like almost 100%. But because there's sort of this vacuum, it's let sort of alternate theories thrive, and people go and dig stuff up that's sort of irrelevant. But I was really interested in why we process disappearance and death so differently when they're often the same thing. So that was part of the original inspiration. And then also just some of the commonalities I noticed amongst these pilots. And this is one thing I wanted to ask you about, because it just seemed like my brother as a child just was obsessed with airplanes, absolutely wanted to fly. No surprise he was a pilot. And so many of these women, and obviously male pilots as well, just it'd be something as simple as they saw an airplane and knew they had to fly. So I was wondering about how you came to fly and what sparked it, and if you always knew it was something you wanted to do or not.
Well, it's interesting. I wanted to fly much further. Like, I wanted to be an astronaut. I wanted to go to space.
Right. Yeah.
The obsession, I was like, oh, well, and I, as part of that, I will get to learn to fly here on Earth as well. But could never afford to do it for the longest time, to actually train. And it really, my grandpa was a general aviation pilot, and my uncle also had a small plane. And so I knew it was within the realm of the possible for sort of ordinary people. Like, you didn't have to be an astronaut to fly. So it was in the back of my mind, like, I always want to do this at some point. I just didn't know how to realize it. And certainly I think there are no two more like impoverishing passions than writing and flying.
Yeah. Like Formula One racing or something.
Maybe sailing, I feel like.
Yeah, it's a good one.
But yeah. So a grand view on our place in the scheme of things, that was always there, and like as a means to that end, sort of the lowest Earth orbit I can manage.
Well, and one thing I found so moving too in the course of my research was, Charles Lindbergh, obviously a very complex and problematic person, but the fact that he, flew across the Atlantic in 1927 in what's essentially a laundry basket with like a lawnmower motor on it, and then he was present at the launch of Apollo 11. I just think that trajectory and that change within one lifetime is amazing. And someone just sent me a letter, I think maybe it's the day Michael Collins died, sent me a letter that Lindbergh had written to Michael Collins, basically expressing envy for his solitude when he was orbiting the moon alone. And he was like, you must have felt like a space god. I was like, wow. He clearly thought Collins had the best gig out of any of them, which just seemed completely in character and fascinated me. Yeah,
it's not the landing on the moon that's appealing. It's like getting to be up there in orbit. Well, and it's interesting. In your book, I feel like obsession, love sprung from nothing, as you put it, is definitely a recurring theme, both in like positive and devastating directions. Like Marion, obsessed with flight, sees a plane, meets these barnstormers, and wants to fly herself, and feels it with this like deep conviction that this was what she was meant to do. I wrote down this line: she couldn't fathom that others did not see for her what she would become, that she did not wear the fact of her future like some eye-catching garment. Her belief that she would fly saturated her world, presented an appearance of absolute truth. And I love that conviction. It's part of what attract people to Marion, including her eventual husband, Barclay, in the book. And yet he's drawn to her with that same sort of obsessiveness, that same sort of like immediate attraction, that is sort of instant and total. I'm just curious about what were you thinking through these ideas of like obsession taken to beautiful and horrible ends? with-
Yeah, I was thinking about that. I mean, some of it was came from a pretty early conversation with my agent. I'm always talking about her, and then she always ends up being on these Zooms. But if she's heard it before, where she really had trouble understanding why Marion would want to do this flight, like why she would want to fly around the world, because it's obviously so dangerous. It's unrewarding in a way. If you fly a circumnavigation, you end up where you started, and the horizon's still there. And so I really had to think through the why, and kind of the most helpful thing I read was in the book The Ice Balloon by Alec Wilkerson, about the sort of failed hot air balloon expedition over the North Pole from Svalbard in the teens, maybe the 1900s, I can't remember. But he's sort of describing how for these early explorers, they just seemed guided by a vision of themselves doing something. And the obscurity of the vision was in itself persuasive. Like the fact that there was no real why was to them a reason to do it. And I really identified with that on a much smaller, more mundane scale, just in my own life. But I really thought that's what the case would be for Marion too. She just, basically got this idea in her head and then needed to fulfill it. And I think that can happen, as you said, in all sorts of ways, like, falling, the idea of love at first sight. And then for personality like Barclay's, having sort of the tenacity to believe that sort of overwhelming first impulse was a sign of something real, which he then has to pursue without real regard for the consequences and without much empathy for what he's doing to other people, particularly Marion. So yeah, I think obsession is fascinating, in partly because of its irrationality.
yeah, the lightning bolt.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was just thinking when you were talking about the circle that goes on and on, these journeys that have no end, and you write about that. Marion writes about that in her logbook. You wrote a piece in Lapham's Quarterly, I think, about Bernard Moitessier, and the fact that he was in the lead for the Golden Globe race to circumnavigate the world, and instead of claiming the prize, he just kept sailing.
Mm-hmm.
And described it as like a mandala, like that
Mm-hmm.
practice out there, and the sort of almost spiritual dimension to that pursuit comes through in a lot of adventurer and explorers accounts, even if they're not maybe.
Totally. And it's funny because I think for Montessier, that sort of spiritual element that he brought to his solo circumnavigation made him really good at it, because he was just in this constant state of, ecstasy in a way. But then it also made him really ill-suited for the sort of modern commercial application of it being a race, and he says, I'm gonna break off from the race to save my soul. In the course of that, abandoning his wife and children, which also seems to be the way. But yeah, I remember reading too something else in the book by Lawrence Gonzalez called Deep Survival. And he sort of looks at who survives, various disasters and extreme situations, and tries to tease out why. And one common thread of, people in lifeboats after shipwrecks or lost in the wilderness is that survivors often tend to still be able to absorb the natural kind of wonder surrounding them. And this seems to be a source of mental fortitude in a way. They're still attuned to their environment and not completely panicked. So I always thought that was really interesting too. Just as what makes someone good at doing these sorts of things or well suited to it.
And others falter. Yeah. Well, it's interesting. There is this sort of like call to oblivion too, that both Marion and then Hadley, her Hollywood actress biopic alter ego in a way, but they're very different. It's like Marion wants oblivion in a kind of pure way, it seems, almost, or a non-destructive way, non-attention seeking way, and the actress, someone calls her out at some point she says she wants to disappear. You know, she's hounded by paparazzi, and she's this target of this cause of the scandal. And someone calls her out and is like, "You don't want to disappear. You want people to wonder where you went."
Yeah.
Through them, like, your Marion leaves. I mean, although, you know, she leaves the logbook that makes people wonder where she went as well. So yeah, just like questions of like, what is the pull towards oblivion?
Yeah, I mean, I think Marion is motivated by a desire for freedom above all else, and that's sort of incompatible with kind of gender roles of the time, and so she has this sort of, you know, feral childhood, and then understands that she needs to fly, and doesn't have a good understanding of how difficult that will be as a woman, and that was another thing I noticed in reading about early women flyers, is that, and Marion comments on this in the book, is that no matter how sort of rugged and dangerous what they were doing was, there's this expectation that they would then be photographed, you know, powdering their nose, or with the really early ones in the 1910s, it'd be like a lot of conversation about whether or not they were wearing corsets. And it always just seemed like you could never quite escape those expectations. And Marion throughout her life has to sort of vigilantly guard her right to have an unorthodox life. Like, it's not something that's a single decision, it's endless decisions over decades. Whereas Hadley, you know, in some ways has perfect freedom in that she's extremely rich, basically, and could do what she wants, but she's also kind of under this crippling public scrutiny. And I think that scrutiny can be paralyzing, this feeling of you're not enacting womanhood correctly, you're not living your life correctly, you know, be sexy, but don't be sexual in some ways. And so Hadley's kind of trying to figure out what kind of life to lead, starting from almost total confusion. Whereas Marion, and that's part of her attraction to Marion, is she sees Marion as somebody who always knew at least one thing she wanted to do, which is true. But that sort of lodestar that Marion had was also the source of a lot of grief and sacrifice and hard work.
Yeah, in many ways it feels like it's a book about like desire and women damned for wanting, like forced to compromise for wanting whatever it is they want.
Yeah, a friend of mine asked while I was writing it, she was like, is it a love story? And I immediately said no. In that it's not, you know, a marriage plot, and I love a marriage plot, but it's not that, and it's not the story of two people coming together, but it is the story of all the loves that one person has in different forms throughout a lifetime, and mostly in forms that don't adhere to sort of more orthodox ways of living. So yeah, I think it's like infused with love, but isn't a love story.
There's a line I love. Hadley says it to like a Vanity Fair reporter, like, love is the opposite of enlightenment.
Yeah, and I think I was talking about this on a thing the other day, I think, where she says, if you don't believe you love someone, then you don't. You know, love also is faith. And I think maybe, I don't know, maybe it's a reach, but just the sort of aloftness of flight and the sort of fragility of that state, I think maybe connects to the way Marion at least experiences love too.
Well, I love like in a way the most enduring love story of the book is sort of the most sort of braided one. Marion and her long time friend, it just keeps popping up in places. It's such a beautiful, you know, like, it's so rare. We want to wrap relationships up. We want to pin people into roles, and I liked how they just kind of, you describe them. I think Marion describes Caleb like an organ at one point.
Yeah, it's a lifelong love, and they're always sort of circling around the idea of commitment and can never quite get there. I think Marion says to Jamie, her brother, at one point that they would be like two hawks in a box. And it's, I think there's so much in life as well. There's so much happenstance with who you become a couple with and or not, and what form commitment takes. And I think there's probably somebody in the world who Marion would have had a more traditional sort of union with, but she meets other people instead.
And then I'm curious, I mean, you claim you're not an adventurer, but you have traveled quite a bit. And according to Marion in her book, well, she's sort of drawn, reading about adventures in her father's collection of books, like Slocum Alone and Planetary and his sloop and Bravery at the Poles. Like there's like this childish simplicity to adventure, very simple striving and simple bravery. So she's like, if you go there or try to, you are brave. So you've gone places, probably tried to go other places, and are you therefore brave?
I mean, it's the travel I did during the time I was writing this and the book just took on this really symbiotic relationship. Like I was a really shy, sort of risk-averse child. Like there's a old family story about when I was 5, and we're in Michigan at my grandparents' house, and my mom said to me and my brother, "Do you want to go to Niagara Falls?" I have no idea what Niagara Falls was, but I just burst out crying. Like, no, why would anyone want to go to Niagara Falls? And I became more interested in travel as I got older and traveled more. And then kind of as I started writing this book, I knew I wanted to go to Antarctica. And I knew I wanted to get to the Arctic. I felt like these were regions I had no confidence in being able to imagine properly. And that's not to say writers can't write about places they haven't been. And it's a privilege and also a product of my circumstances of like not having children, not having big responsibilities, that I was able to do this. But yeah, I started travel writing, and just all my pitches would tend to be like, okay, so there's a deserted wasteland, like nobody's there, and the magazine editors would be like, well, is there like a lodge we can take pictures of? Is there literally anything? And I'm like, no. And so, eventually like a couple of those got through. My second travel assignment ever was to the New Zealand subantarctic. And then that's where I met someone who ran tourist expeditions to Antarctica, and I wrote a Modern Love about this. People can Google it if you want to read it. And so as basically our first date, we went to the Ross Sea in Antarctica for 5 weeks. I was on that ship. It was incredible. And it was also, I think that went into the book as well, and that our connection was so rooted in the fact that we both love this landscape. We're drawn to landscapes like this. And he is this incredibly competent, seaman, and he'd been deep knowledge of Antarctica in the way almost no one else has. And to me, that was completely fascinating. And that's the type of person I started to encounter on my trips, especially as then, editors would be more like, well, we have this story to a wasteland, like maybe Maggie would want to go. And so I'd get more. And so, I mean, that's why I always say I'm not like really an adventurer. Like when you meet people like you who are just like so hardcore, can exist in these places, then like, I would never presume. But on the other hand, like during this period, I think my risk aversion has shifted and my comfort zone has expanded, because there are always things I'm nervous about doing, and then, do it anyway. And then the next risk seems more palatable. Like the example I always point to is that I've always been afraid of deep water. The idea of swimming the open ocean is horrifying to me, but I really wanted to swim with humpback whales. And so I pitched this story where I swam with humpback whales in Tonga. And it was, of course, incredible and transcendent and life-changing. And so then after that, it was like, okay, well, I didn't know if that would just be sustained terror. It wasn't. So this other thing I'm afraid of might work out as well.
Yeah, it really seems those incremental, I mean, I wouldn't characterize myself. First of all, my neighbors are way more adventurous than me. Half people in Atlanta are way more adventurous than me. I just write about it. I'm like the babbler that tells the story. But I think I really relate to that incremental approach. I mean, yeah, and you don't have to leap into the big epic script straight off the bat. Just like get on your bike and head down the road and plan to camp out for the night. And then you realize it's not that intimidating and you go a little further. And it was very much like that for me. I was not I tried things bit by bit.
Yeah, and that's probably wise. I mean, I think you run afoul of nature if you try the big trip right away. Yeah, I've thought about that a lot. I wrote an essay for an anthology that's coming out called Horse Girls, and it's about women and horses. I was a competitive horseback rider in my teens, and I think that also, taught me to be comfortable with fear in a way too. Like I was always afraid. It was always scary to jump higher, and then I would just have to do it anyway, and usually it was fine. And so that lesson, I think we think of epiphany as being a sudden realization. I guess it is by definition, but I also think you can have these sort of, yeah, as you said, incremental shifts that then sort of play out not so differently from epiphanies.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm curious as a fellow writer, I kind of want to ask some craft questions while I can. How did you approach writing this book? It's massive. You thank Scrivener in your acknowledgements. How does one begin such a braided, plot-driven yet character-driven? How did you do it?
Well, I don't plan or outline. So I did not know what I was getting into, which was probably a blessing and a curse. I just started, and I wrote probably, I think what I read out loud, the very beginning of the book, I think I wrote that first. And then I don't know why I was like, but it should start in a shipyard before the main character is born. And there should be an ocean liner. I should buy a bunch of books about ocean liners. I really just follow my impulses, kind of like a dog chasing a ball, and then and then the next piece sort of builds off that. So I just started going. I had written both my other books in less than a year each. And so in my head, that's how long it took to write a book. This was incorrect. I got 2 years in and I'd written more than 400 pages, and it dawned on me that I wasn't halfway through. And that was kind of a dark day. Like, it was just so overwhelming to think that all the work I'd done, I would have to do again, essentially, like that I wasn't halfway there. And so I really just had to not think about the whole and just do each little bit at a time. So Scrivener, I've been promoting Scrivener so hardcore. For people who don't know, it's a writing application, and it allows, instead of having, a Microsoft Word document for each chapter and having them all open at the same time, it kind of lets you keep all those documents like in one document. And so you can shift around the order. You can set documents side by side. You can sort of keep your research within it, although I didn't use a ton of those features. I just had to sort of move forward, and as I researched, I'd come across things that would spark something else, like this historic figure sitting in the water grizzly, who is a native person, and what we would probably call transgender now. And he fascinated me. And so in he went, and wartime artists, all these things. There were sort of some more outlandish plot lines so it was 3.5 years to write the first draft. My agent read it. I revised for about a year, and then I sold it to my publisher 2 years and 8 months ago. So it's also a long runway to publishing it. And my editor, Jordan, and I probably did 4 drafts, and a lot of that was compression. So it lost 250 manuscript pages, which would be fewer typeset pages in that process, and mostly just through pervasive small cuts, which that was one of the benefits of having such a long book, because you do enough of that, you cut a lot of the book. So yeah, it was, the short answer to your question is just that it was a total nightmare. It felt completely disorganized and overwhelming. I just had to hope I could get through it. I didn't know how it would end. It was really rough. It was awful.
Pulled it off.
I will say I did have sort of waypoints. I always need like something to aim for. So from the beginning, I did know she'd fly in the war, although I hadn't decided if it would be in the US or the UK. So something like that just gave me a little bit of a destination. And also that was sort of the measurement by which I knew I wasn't halfway through. I was like, this is 400 and however many pages and I'm not to World War II yet. So.
Wow. And yeah, have you been able to think about what's next? Or are you still so immersed in this process of putting it out?
I had a couple of false starts. Well, so I have a short story collection coming out probably next summer, which we haven't started editing yet, although the stories have been around for a while. So that's technically next. I really like to read mysteries, and so I had an idea for sort of a trilogy of mysteries, but this past summer, I guess, over kind of the George Floyd protests, I realized I didn't really want to center cops in 3 books, and I think it's sort of inevitable. So then finally, I'm now working on something that I think has legs, and just the very small starting idea was that I was curious about what happens when people who don't like each other get married and then stay married.
Oh, wow.
So I think more of a family, a little bit more like seating arrangements maybe, but in LA. And I'm sure it'll just like sprawl and get unruly like everything does. We'll see.
The humpbacks will.
Yeah.
What do you do, or what writers do you turn to? What do you do as kind of a spark or galvanizer for inspiration, like to get in the zone for writing yourself? Do you read a lot? Do you go for long walks?
Yeah, I with this book, I had a bunch of novels that I would sort of turn to, when I needed some momentum. I'd read just a few pages. So like Elizabeth Gilbert's The Signature of All Things, I really love. Life After Life by Kate Atkinson. Tale for the Time Being by Ruth Ozeki, another Pacific Northwest book. Pachinko, All the Light We Cannot See. A lot of these sort of long, sort of sometimes lyrical books, and also ones with complex structures like Life After Life and A Tale for the Time Being. But then I also, and Veronica by Mary Gaitskill, that's my sort of main touchstone for Hadley's sections. But then because Hadley's sections are in present tense, I also needed something in present tense. Or no, sorry. Hers aren't. The incomplete histories are in present tense. So my funny present tense books that has nothing in common with this book was Wolf Hall, and I would just read a few pages. And I found that if I'm writing in a certain verb tense and I start, sorry, my dog is scrabbling on a very noisy bed. Stop it. If I start reading something in the wrong verb tense, it then, without noticing it, I'll switch as I'm writing. And then I have to go back and undo a verb tense in 10 pages because of this weird brain thing that happens. So I have to pay close attention to that. But it's really been great being done with the book. And I feel like I've enjoyed reading more this past year and a half than I have in a long time. Yeah.
And pushback, or the publisher pushed back the book release because of the pandemic?
No, I can't remember exactly when we set the publication date, but it might have been before the pandemic or right around then. And I remember being sort of a little bit huffy about how long we were waiting to publish it. And then it's turned out to be, I think, probably ideal. I mean, I think the themes of the book are things that people are thinking about now, this freedom, this movement, the idea of, how do you want to spend your one life? What do you want to see in the world? I always say like journeys, as you said too, don't have to be to the far-flung regions. Journeys can happen close to home, but I think it's always worth sort of considering what journeys you want to make, and what's important to do kind of in the time that we have. And I think the pandemic was a reminder that everything can change so quickly. Like, it never occurred to me that I wouldn't be able to travel, let alone that I wouldn't be able to go take my laptop to my neighborhood cafe where I usually work. And I found that I miss that sort of ambient inspiration so much.
Mhm. Sort of energy of other people.
Exactly.
And how have you handled the pandemic? I mean, what has it meant for it's got to be a weird time, especially waiting for a book to come out. It's always like anxious build period, full of like, you get early reviews and it's exciting, but then this thing you've made is going to go out in the world for judgment. And you have no more control. And really those
Yeah.
people cooped up at home.
Yeah. I mean, I've been healthy and safe, and so is my family, so it's hard to complain. But yeah, it's interesting. I mean, in some ways it seems by this point we're so used to communicating via Zoom that it seems almost natural to do the book tour this way. And it's also, it's accessible for a lot of people, all these events. And then I get to have conversations with people like yourself who aren't necessarily in the place. Like there's a wild freedom to it, just to be like, who can we get to, do an event at a bookstore anywhere, and it can be done. It's a little bit strange. It makes it more abstract. Like I can't take the temperature of a room of people at an event, or you don't sign people's books in person and hear voices asking questions. They just show up in the Q&A, which, by the way, if you have questions, put them in the Q&A. But yeah, I think it's okay. I think I'd be more sad if it were my first book or even my second book, not getting the experience of being on tour. But having done it a couple times and knowing I'll do it again, this is okay.
Yeah. You've got Gus, your new pandemic pup.
Yeah, Gus, who's over here having stopped making noise finally, I was saying, I don't know if people were on when we were talking about it, but I adopted him at the beginning of the pandemic, and yeah, he's afraid of all other dogs. He's afraid of squeaker toys. His one simple request is to spend every minute with me until the end of his life, which is not doable. But yeah.
What's going to happen when you start traveling again?
I don't know. I did one road trip for a travel magazine to Oregon last month, and that was the first time he stayed with my parents. And he adapted, but it took about a day and a half. And he registered his protest by just doing these crazy wolf howls. Like he just stand there and howl to the ceiling sort of 6 times, which I've never seen him do except in his sleep. Like I'll wake up in the middle of the night to this like primal howl that he does in his dreams. It's so strange.
Must be dreaming that you're gone.
I don't know what's in this guy's past, but yeah, maybe.
And when you finished a novel of this scope, I mean, you lived in it for so many years. Is it hard to sort of step out? Are you going to do anything with those 250 discarded pages? To be a sequel?
I mean, I think it's kind of a relief. I don't know if this has been your experience. You'll have to tell me, but I think it's almost like having to do copy edits and then 2 rounds of page proofs on a 600-page book was just a really good way to make me incredibly done with it. I was like, I'm so glad I cut every page. If this were 1 page longer, I would freak out. Like I cannot read it again. I never want to see it again. And then fortunately there's like a bit of a break before I had to start talking about it every day. So yeah, it seems like a natural break. And then with all my books, I've sort of relished the opportunity to explore something new. So I'm also looking forward to that. Although when I did try to start a new book, I was like, oh, right, the blank page is sort of incredibly daunting. I hadn't had to grapple with it for 7 years because I'd always had this in progress, and it was so much easier in some ways to come in the middle. So I don't know. How about you? Do you find it difficult to transition out?
Oh, I've only had one go at it, and I was so done. I was so done.
Mm-hmm.
And like you, I sort of recovered by the time the book came out to the point where I could talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it took everything out of me, and I was so sick of it. But it took me a long time, and I think my mistake was not like reading deeply and thinking about the next project. I was like so eager to live again. I didn't want to live on the page. I wanted to like live in the world. I wanted to do things, and that's basically when I signed up for the pilot's license. Because I want something tangible with consequences.
Mhm.
There are checklists. Like,
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it depletes you. I think that's how I felt too at the end. I just felt depleted. Like everything I'd cared about or thought about or been preoccupied with for 6 years of actual writing time and editing time was in the book. And I was just like, I have no more thoughts. I don't have anything to add. This is it. Yeah. And particularly with the pandemic, then to sort of replenish yourself became more challenging. There's just sort of less life to be had.
no kidding. No, it's such a weird. What is it like for you to have people read your book? What's it like to have an audience? I mean, are you after your first book was published, were you very aware that you would have an audience from that point on?
Yeah, well, I don't know. It's funny. I really don't think about readers when I'm writing, like not at all. And I've had a bunch of interviewers about this book be like, so this book has a lot of sex in it. And I'm always like, yeah, but I think because I'm not thinking about readers, I'm not self-conscious writing about it. And then in some ways it's, this incredible feeling of flourishing as people start to read it. It's no longer my weird kind of imaginary world that I have to try to explain to people. People can read it for themselves if they want to. And sharing it with friends and my family. That's really exciting. And then of course there's kind of the harder parts too. Like as like Amazon and Goodreads reviews start to go up, I do not read those. Like That Way Madness Lies. And so it's sort of, you become more aware that not everyone likes your book. And that's the deal. That's fine. Taste is taste. Not everything speaks to everyone, but sometimes it's a little bit more difficult to make peace with in reality. And then too, I think like a week before the pub date, I had the same pub date in the US and the UK. And so kind of the first review showed up, like newspaper review, and my publicist forwarded it to me. And I was a little taken back because I hadn't remembered that I was entering this phase where at any moment something can like jump out of the bushes at you and be like, this newspaper hates your book, or like, this newspaper loves your book. And so I had a really anxious week, and now I think most of that stuff is over and out. And so that's been a relief now. But then of course, immediately as you're desperate for things to die down and get quieter. And then as soon as they do, you're like, nobody loves me. Nobody remembers my book. It's been like 3 days.
Like Hadley.
Yeah. Well, it's such a funny, I don't know, like being that, what makes you able to write a book. And I'd also like to hear what you think about this, like sitting alone in a room for years is really different from promoting a book. And now like one of the big differences between publishing Astonish Me in 2014 and this is like the expectation that you can create a lot of like content. So I've had to make so many videos of myself, staring into my phone being like, hi everyone, I'm Maggie Shipstead and blah blah blah. And it's hard. It's a skill. I mean, I had to do something last week where I had to talk and like walk in front of a camera, and you think you know how to walk until somebody's filming you, and then you're like, which arm is that? So it's kind of a trip. I don't know. Did you mind the publicity process, or was it?
I found it pretty. I'm not the kind of person that gets energy from being in the spotlight. I would much rather back the room, taking notes or something.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, I found it was exhilarating, but really draining.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's also where maybe in the pilot section or during that period, I just have something very like absorbing where I wasn't thinking about myself at all or my words.
Mm-hmm.
I could focus on something very tangible. But yeah, it's sort of this like giddy, draining exposure.
Yeah, I hadn't had much clarity on that until actually like I was at a book festival. Oh, here's Gus. Hi. Are you going to be in the foreground? No. Okay. I did a book event with this writer, Daniel Wallace, and at the Southern Festival of Books, and he said, how do you like the festival? And I said, oh, it's great, but I'm really an introvert, and so I find it exhausting. And he said, no, you're a gregarious introvert, so you can turn it on, but you don't gain energy from it. And that energy flow is something I hadn't heard articulated before, and it never occurred to me that there are people in this world who actually gain energy from interacting with other people, but indeed there are.
The term, the writer Annie Dillard, she describes herself as a gregarious recluse.
Mm-hmm.
That's putting it. But I feel like I've been hogging all the questions. I don't know if there are.
Yeah, I thought Rick was coming back.
I'm around. I'm
Okay.
here. And it's a mix of some questions and comments. We have an adventurous group here because just the most recent comment, Diana, there had been an earlier comment about Carl Markham's West with the Night, and Diana in the chat saying she read West with the Night while flying south across Africa, and then Kate's Land of Lost Borders going to Antarctica. So people have not, this audience is not a stay-at-home audience of armchair. They're taking their books with them. I'll get this. There's a few questions, but one thing I was going to mention from the book, and it's a few things that move around in the book, and part of them I was thinking about also the pandemic time where a lot of people are cleaning out their things because haven't been going anywhere. But one of the things are letters in the book, both that are currently exchanged and at times found later, and it's not like something that someone did or didn't throw away, but it feels like those letters play a part in the narrative. I mean, how people put together stories of people. Since part of the book is other people trying to figure out stories of people who've lived. I mean, you, as a writer, you do this wonderfully because the reader gets to see all this, but the characters in the book often don't always know what's going on, and then they're trying to piece together other parts of the story. And letters seem to play a part with some of that.
Yeah, well, it's hard to wrap your mind around, right? Because letters were such useful artifacts of people's lives for so long. And now if someone said to me, okay, when you die, everything we take from you will be from your email inbox, I'd be like horrified. But yeah, letters were actually part of my research process. I went to the Hoover Institution at Stanford, and they have kept the papers of several American women who went to the UK during the war to fly for the Air Transport Auxiliary. So it was a civilian organization that transported warplanes like between factories and fields or to repair depots, and it was incredibly dangerous. They didn't use instruments. They had Germans were buzzing around shooting at things. They crashed all the time. They had sort of the same fatality rate as the RAF. But so these women's papers included just hundreds of sort of onion skin letters home describing their experience. And so just the sort of density of storytelling in these completely ordinary documents and what good writers people were kind of was useful to me both from a research perspective and just feeling free to include letters as part of the narrative, which is also in some ways an efficiency thing, just letting the characters say something for themselves every once in a while. Despite it being so long, I was always looking to cut corners.
Yeah, well, it worked wonderfully. The other thing I was going to say, I mean, you and Kate have both touched on a lot, but it's something of the scope and scale of the book is there's many more stories and characters, but one of the central characters is Marion's twin brother Jamie, who shares a lot of they have their own bond, and they share the same complicated origin, and actually he has his own complicated life, but whereas Marion becomes famous, or she has this life of being this pilot. His is with art, and his work, his paintings have this funny life in the book too. They end up in collectors' places, they end up in museums, and they end up in some other houses and along the way. But there's that other way of traces of someone that move around, and it's again as part of a story as people trying to put together other people's stories.
Yeah. And, I think as an artist writing about any kind of art, you're inevitably sort of writing about writing or talking about your own art. So Jamie's paintings became what he really wants to do more than anything is capture immensity. And he's thinking about sort of, the visual dome we live in and how impossible it is to translate that to something flat. And so he starts to incorporate these sort of bends and then almost like folds into his images. And I think, this of course is a book concerned with immensity as well, and about how impossible it is to capture the vastness of anything, even a single life. So that was, a way for me to sort of talk about that. And I did look at particularly Canadian landscape painters of that era, like Lauren Harris. And then I came across this documentary about these wartime artists and looked at a lot of their work as well, which I didn't realize that all the branches of the armed service recruited artists and gave them the assignment to, quote, capture the spirit or essence of war, which they, their work does in a way that's different than photographs. And I think was a really prescient idea for the military to have.
Yeah, I do think, you mentioned people looking for a real Marion Graves, like how they're trying to find her. I think, and certainly partly because some of the Jamie's artwork works its way into the world here in Seattle. There will be people trying to figure out who Jamie Graves was, or is there somebody who was here that he's modeled on? Because you do a lot of, and this is again especially for people who are not in Seattle. There's a part of the Seattle art world in the 1940s that you capture really well. About there's a existing museum, but there's other collections and all that. I can read into that who that could have been, and at least not so much Jamie, but the families doing this artwork. So let's get to some. Joe has a question. Starting off with, he hasn't had a chance to read the book yet, but talking about the lead character, Marion, flying in a WW-23 as a ferry pilot. Have you ever come across a book by Y.M. Lucas titled WAAF with Wings, published in 1992? He's asking a little bit about, I think he reads about flights and planes, because he's got there's a small press in the UK in 1992, and he gives a line about the women pilots of that period. Yeah.
No, I don't know that book in particular. Some of the books I drew on for the ATA part of the book, there's a really good one called Spitfire Women. And I also particularly love Diana Barnado Walker's memoir called Spreading My Wings. And she was from this very elite background, was kind of almost a caricature of a flapper driving fast cars and riding fast horses, and has this experience of needing to fly. And her memoir of the war is just, I read it in one sitting. It's incredibly engaging. And one thing she did was sort of figure out almost a smuggling racket after toward the very end of the war, when she started ferrying planes to mainland Europe. And there were things that you could get there that you couldn't get in Britain, and vice versa. So she, instead of carrying a parachute, she would fill her, take an empty parachute bag and then bring back chocolate from Belgium, which she'd trade on the black market for sort of luxury goods from the UK, and then take them back and sell them, and so on and so forth. So yeah, that's a really interesting read.
And then following Joe's comments and question, Kathleen, probably with, again, more comments, partly because she'd been wondering what you talked about handling attention after writing a book like this. And of course, the attention's a little bit different now in the pandemic world. You're not out having people, I mean, I've there's always those stories too of people getting in a taxi cab in a strange city, or getting on a plane and seeing somebody pick up their book, like the person next to you on the plane is reading your book, which you're not getting to do that way. But there are those kind of moments where, or it's a taxi cab where we had an author once say, "Oh, I'm going to our bookstore, Elliott Bay," and they says, "Oh, guess who's reading there tonight?" And like, I guess that's me. Wait, they didn't know, because that taxi driver, Seattle's always had some good reading taxi drivers. There's that. So anyway, but also in the chat, Karen had posted this anthology, Horse Girls, that's coming out this summer, and Kathleen's also looking forward not only to Great Circle, but also to that anthology coming out. We didn't really say what the title Great Circle comes from, that did we? Or is it, I don't think that got touched on, did it?
No, yeah, it's happy to describe it. It's explained in the very beginning of the book, but the great circle is the circumference of a sphere at its largest point. So the equator is a great circle, and then all the lines of longitude. So, the curved flight paths that we take are following segments of great circles because it's the shortest distance between 2 points on a sphere. And it's so funny because everyone feels really firmly that this should be called The Great Circle, to the point where when the New York Times review went up, it said The Great Circle. And even like my publisher in the UK would send me emails about The Great Circle. And I was just like, "This Great Circle." And I think at some point I probably should have taken the hint and just changed it. But to me, it was never about, I didn't want it to seem like the title was about Marion's flight. I guess I wanted it to have more room in the concept of it than just being the great circle. And I also didn't want to imply that there was only one, because in fact there are infinite great circles on a sphere. So yeah.
And you do there, it appears in various ways here, for all the sort of the one given as the flying motif to it. Kate, an audience person who I think has been in touch with you, Bruce, has a question, and he's looking forward to reading Maggie's book, but he wants to know what you're working on now, what the next book is with you. And we talked about this beforehand, but not with others listening.
Right, that was in the pre-show. I'm working on a book that's about living off grid and learning to fly, and how those aren't so very different as experiences. It's sort of, I pitched it, this was the year before COVID hit. I pitched it as kind of a memoir about wanderlust gone local. A traveler that tries to stay home and put down roots in a deep and meaningful way. And then COVID hit. And in the writing of it, it's become much more about, what does it mean to really land on this planet? And that doesn't necessarily mean stasis, because I'm flying all the time in the book, but I take off and land all the time on the same runway. My destination and departure always read the same in my logbook, and yet it's been the most far-flung, exhilarating adventure I've ever gone on. Just circling around above the land I thought I knew pretty well on the ground. So that's what the book is about. It's kind of a travelogue about going nowhere, and it's evolving by the day. So
I can't wait to read that. I'm disappointed I can't read it right now. It sounds so good.
And for everyone to know, because again, we get introduced, and this really is the first time that Maggie and Kate have visited. So that's part of the gift of these kinds of programs. But we're just even more initially getting acquainted. And I had asked Kate, because Lands of Lost Borders has a different publisher in Canada, and actually in North American English language publishing, the publisher I always look to first is Knopf in New York, of the US. I mean, they're just, what they do, it sort of through everything is the kind of books you really look for, and not every single book, but there's a consistency and a high standard. Maybe this one right after that, because I don't see it as readily, is Knopf in Canada, out of Toronto. And so they do amazing books, and not all the books go back and forth, but one of those, I think Kate's Land of Lost Borders was published by Knopf there, but someone at Knopf in the US unwisely did not pick it up, and it got picked up by another publisher. But it does have Knopf for when it does come out in the US. So that when that day comes, Toronto and New York will both be releasing Kate's book, which I think is still a little more writing to be done for, but we look forward to it. And I think that's it with questions, which tells me that if maybe there'll be real in-person visits when this book is in paperback, when things hopefully are better and safer. But I think after a few weeks with this book in the world, people are going to have a whole different level of questions for Maggie. as it's read. And because I think Kate and I each, having read it, and a few, and there's a lot more to, but this format doesn't contain that in some way, but the magnitude of questions, but there is going to be a lot more on this and of this as people, because it really is a book to kind of you inhabit it, but it inhabits you. And I think it changes, it affects how you see and how all sorts of things, the sky, the trees outside, everything. It's got a sense of the world and being in it and alive, and the one life we have. Thank you both. Kate, it's been a delight also, because we've not gotten to meet you before in this form or any form in terms of you with your book, and a pleasure it's been for you to be with us, and with Maggie, whose work and whose presence has been a little more familiar, but great to do this tonight. Gus has been a nice part of it. There was we love that moment of Gus getting a little cameo. So both of you, thank you so much. And thank you again, everyone. It's getting on in the night. We're at 7 o'clock in our time zones. Are you in the same time zone, Kate? You are you? Okay, yeah. So we have people in Toronto and other points east here, I know. In fact, I assume Rebecca, who's Maggie's agent, is somewhere back that way too. But maybe not. Everyone's could be anywhere right now. So thank you all again, and do come visit us. That's the other thing from a year ago when some books were being published and no one could walk into any bookstore anywhere, and most bookstores, ours included, or people can come in now. So for all the things we still can't all do, we can do that, and we're grateful. And thank you both so much, and thank you for this great and marvelous book, Maggie.
Thank you so much for having me, and thanks a million, Kate. I really appreciate it. It was great to finally meet you.
My total pleasure. So thanks for having me, Rick, and
yes.
So awesome. I love your book.
We'll keep in touch, Kate, both of you. Yes, thank you both. Good luck with all else, and you need your vaccines up there too. Hopefully that will happen for you up there. Yeah.
We've been lucky in the north, but Canada as a whole is.
Yeah. Okay. Good. All right. Thank you.
All right. Thanks. Bye.
Bye.